Alexa, stop. It's Glamour City, ladies and gentlemen, and I am here to read you chapter 21 of Whale Song. It's glamorous. Matsky Institute waited impatiently for me like an old haunt, ravenous for its next sacrifice. It was surrounded by a ghostly mist and looked deathly dreary in the depressing thunderstorm. Its walls were drenched with slick rain, the torrential downpour beating in tinny rooftops like a band of drummers. The gates squeaked open, resisting. I moved forward, chilled to the bone. Walking down the brightly lit hallway, I passed curious guards escorting sullen inmates back to their cells. I held my head high, but my stomach churned, not in fear, but in guilt. I recalled Nana's wise words, "Forgiveness sets you free." When I reached the visitors' area, I sat in a quiet corner, waiting. I gazed directly into the eyes of each inmate. Suspicious of me, they sauntered away like disappointed children. My father reached the table and I stared at him, taking in every line and wrinkle, every bruise and scar. His gaze met mine, and I sensed his uncertainty. I had no idea where to begin. I'm so happy you're here, Sarah," he said. A strained silence surrounded us. "I'd like to know if you'll see me," he said, "when I'm out in 2 weeks. I'd like to be part of your life again." So many emotions were trapped in my heart. My eyes burned with unshed tears, and I ached to tell him the truth, what I remembered. "You didn't ask me," I whispered. My father frowned. "Oh, sorry. Will you let me be part—" I shook my head, interrupting him. "No, you didn't ask me if I remember." He stared past me, and I saw the muscles constricting in his throat. I could almost taste his fear. After a moment, his blue eyes captured mine. They watered as he took a deep breath. "Sarah—" "Why?" I demanded, shaking my head slowly. He reached for my hand. "Because I love you." "But Dad," I moaned, "all these years, you were innocent." "I knew that, Sarah, but I had no idea that they'd find me guilty and that I'd end up here. All I could think about was you. Your doctor warned me that forcing your memory would be too dangerous." I sobbed quietly. "I loved her, you know. I really loved her." "I know you did, honey. I never told you what she said." I swallowed hard. "She said, 'Let me go.'" There was a long silence. Then my father slumped in his chair. "What exactly do you remember?" "Everything. Dad, can you ever forgive me?" "Sarah, honey," he whispered, "I'm the one who needs forgiveness. For not being stronger. For not insisting you visit me. For leaving you alone to cope with it all." A tear slipped from his eye. "Tell me what you remember." I glared at him. Mom doesn't want to be stuck on these machines. My father sighed, his blue eyes flashing at me with frustration. "I'll go to the courthouse and request a removal of all life support." "But that'll take too long. I can't believe that you don't care what Mom wants." "Sarah, I can't make that decision. You can't. Why can't you understand that? As long as there are signs of life." "Life?" I shouted. "You call that life? Look at her. She's already dead." He gaped at me, then stormed out of the room. Alone, I felt angry and abandoned. Time moved in slow frames, flickering from past to present. I glanced at my mother's comatose body in the bed and recalled her plea, the words she had said to me before she slipped into the coma. "Let me go, Sarah. Let me go." Working myself into a frenzy of despair, I moaned. "Okay, Mom, I'll let you go now. Dad won't do it, but I will." I pushed away from her and tugged at each cord, each connection, twisting and turning buttons until every machine was inactive. The monitors ceased their incessant noise in their futile attempts to give my mother life. The room grew deathly still. "I love you, Mommy," I whispered hoarsely. With the respirator cord lying lifeless in my hand, I embraced my mother again and felt the last remnants of air escape her lungs. Her eyes were closed and she looked peaceful, an angel without wings. I brushed her hair gently with my fingers, tracing the angles of her face. One last time I kissed her. Then I draped myself across her. I stayed like that for a long time, praying for escape. The anguish I felt was so intense that I wanted to die alongside my mother, but instead my mind retreated into a fog. Suddenly the door opened. My father stood, paralyzed and speechless, unable to comprehend what I had done. He forced himself toward the bed, calling my name, but I was lost in a figure-like state. He peeled me away from my mother's lifeless body and gently removed the cord from my hand. He raised his tear-streaked face, and his penetrating gaze made me shiver. "Sarah," he moaned in an anguished voice, "what have you done?" The horror in his voice made me do the only thing I could. I ran. When I finished telling him what I remembered, my father didn't say a word. Instead, he glanced over my shoulder, and I saw every emotion cross his face. He had taken a terrible risk, and had paid for my actions with almost a decade of his life. "What now?" I asked apprehensively. "We go on with our lives." I glanced at the steel bars in the window. When the truth comes out, will they lock me up?" He shook his head. "You were a traumatized child back then. Why do you think I didn't say anything all these years? No one needs to know, Sarah. But I know the truth. The truth doesn't matter now, except to you and me." A bouquet of lavender roses had been left on my doorstep. I picked it up and inhaled the fragrant scent. I was about to read the card when I heard the soft scrunch of footsteps on the grass. "They're from me." I spun on my heel. Adam leaned against a tree. For our 1-week anniversary. My breath caught in my throat, and before I realized what I was doing, I threw myself into his arms. I felt his heart pounding, beating like a native drum. His lips caressed my hair while his lean body pressed intimately against me. We stayed like that for a long time. "Well, well," he said finally. "That's some way to greet a guy. You do that with all the guys who come knocking?" I laughed and dragged myself away. "Just the cute ones." Unlocking my front door, I pushed it open and we stepped inside. I dropped my keys on the table by the door, then followed Adam into the living room. He sat on the couch and pulled me down beside him. "How did it go?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "What do you mean?" "With your dad. I know you visited him today." I chewed my bottom lip. Your dad and I have been exchanging letters for the past few years," he said with a chuckle. "He's been a mentor to me. He actually got me the temp job at the Sea Corps. If I had a question, your father would advise me. In fact, when my boss told me I could name the new schooner, I wrote to your dad to see if he had any suggestions." I wove my fingers through his. "Did he?" He nodded. "He suggested a great name, one that reminded me of your mum." I waited. When he remained silent, I nudged him. "Well, what is it?" He spread his arms along the top of the couch, stretching like a wildcat. "You'll have to wait and see." Trying not to laugh, I held a pillow above his head. "Tell me." He pursed his lips and endured a soft thump to the head before grabbing the pillow from my hands. Then he leaned over and kissed me soundly on the lips. "Don't do that, kids. Keep your lips to yourselves." During the next week, I plunged headfirst into waters I had never dared to swim. Never before had I allowed myself to be vulnerable, to love someone openly and honestly. Adam awoke in me feelings that I never knew I had. He was my salvation. I struggled daily with the guilt that I felt regarding my father. Eventually, I realized that he was right. Even if the truth were to come out, it would make no difference. We had both suffered and paid in our own way. It was time to move on. On the day of my father's release, Adam drove me to the gates of the prison. I felt apprehensive about my father's future. What will he do? Where will he live? Glancing up at the bleak prison walls, I realized that I would never have to lay eyes upon Mansky Institute again. Adam squeezed my hand gently. "It's going to be fine." The old metal gates squealed open, and my father stepped out into the sunlight. He looked around uncertainly until he saw us. "Hey," he greeted us, hauling a small suitcase in one hand. I rushed from the car and gave him a hug. Adam shook my father's hand. "Nice to see you again, Jack." I studied my two men for a moment. Then I grabbed the suitcase and threw it into the trunk. Sitting in the back seat, I patted the space beside me and smiled to my father. "Get in." He hesitated. "Give me a minute." Under a brilliant blue sky, he closed his eyes, sucked in a breath, and stretched his arms to the heavens. I could only imagine what my father must have felt. Free at last. We all were. My father moved in with me. "Just until I find an apartment," he said. On his second day of freedom, we sifted through the boxes that were stored in my basement. There were numerous cartons containing my parents' belongings. "When you find your own place," I said, "you can take those with you, Dad. You'll want some of your mom's things, too." He rummaged through a large crate, and I saw him secretly pocket a few items. I left him in the basement, surrounded by half-open cartons and bittersweet memories in the kitchen. I made some strawberry tea and wandered about the house aimlessly. Sarah? My father's voice echoed from the basement. I heard his footsteps thump up the wooden stairs. When he reached me, he had something in his hands. A painting wrapped in a fragment of old fabric. Mum wanted you to have this. He peeled off the cloth. The vision of a family of killer whales swimming in a lush lagoon made my eyes water. A crystal waterfall flowed from the forest above like a silky sheet of satin. This was the last painting Mum ever made, my father said softly, and she painted it for you. He handed me the painting. She named it on the back. I turned it over and let out a gasp.